Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see such a big turnout. I see there are still more people filing in, so this is great. This is exciting. Welcome. Welcome to our fourth Politics Forum event of the semester. For those of you who are new to TCNJ or new to Politics Forum programming, the Politics Forum is sponsored by the Department of Political Science. It is a forum for the presentation of analytical and/or empirical research concerning political power, institutions, and choices. We welcome presentations by faculty from across the social sciences and the humanities whose research bears on these matters. Just looking ahead, our fifth and final event of the semester is going to be 1 week from today on November the 17th. We'll have Professor Jonathan Collins from Brown University, who will present on the topic of education, democracy, and racial justice during the COVID-19 period. You'll be able to find registration information for that event on the Politics Forum webpage. Today, however, our speaker is TCNJ's own Dan Bowen. Dr. Bowen is an associate professor of political science. He teaches and does research on state politics and public opinion in the United States. And his talk today is called Making Sense of the 2020 Presidential Election. And with that, I will turn the floor over to him. And after his talk, we will have plenty of time for Q&A. So over to you, Dr. Bowen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Talutis. It's really a pleasure to be able to be here and speak with all of you. It's a little bit odd because I can see I can see Dr. Talutis and Susan Shabilia here on my Zoom, and then everyone else is just gone. I wish I could be here in a room with you all, speaking with you and interacting with you, but it is nice to be able to still talk together. Now, during my presentation, please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A or through the chat. I probably won't be able to keep track of it while I'm talking, but Nick and Susan, if a question seems really pertinent and is worth interrupting me, please just go ahead and do so, and we can slow down and talk. So my talk today is entitled Making Sense of the 2020 Presidential Election. Maybe a little bit of hubris here. I don't know how much sense I'll be making, but hopefully at least there's some interesting things that we can talk about today together. And I'm glad we have some results at all to talk about. For a while there, who knew? So let me give you a brief overview of how I have this talk structured. Well, first, give some general feedback or thoughts about the 2020 election and what I think is sort of the broad strokes what just happened. We'll take a little detour to talk about vote choice, why people vote the way they do, and then why it matters for how we understand election results. And then most of the talk will be about the actual election results, and in particular, some of my analysis based on county level election returns, and what I think we can sort of glean from that. If we have some time, we'll reflect just briefly about what went wrong with the polling. And we don't know a lot about this right now, but we can sort of speculate a little bit. Whether we have any mandates or not, I think is an important question, maybe something you can think about during the talk. And I'll give you my suggestion here at the end. And then a little bit of comments about where we'll be headed here in the future. So that's a general overview of the talk. I think it's important to put this election in context. The context is we have a global pandemic with over 230,000, 240,000 Americans who have died due to COVID-19. That, by the way, a pandemic that doesn't look at all in control, and we're well into what looks like a second wave across the country and here in New Jersey. We have an impeached president, one of only 4 if you count Nixon, to be impeached in the United States history, which speaks to sort of his political position and also the scandals that he has that have been a part of his presidency for the last 4 years. We've seen drastic changes to voting methodology in many states, states like New Jersey, having new experiences with vote by mail, and in response to the pandemic, but very large scale changes to how we vote in many places. We had 4 years of mass mobilizations, from the Women's March and the Me Too movement earlier on in the Trump presidency to protests against police brutality here this year in response to George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement. These are some of the largest social movements in US history have taken place in the last 4 years. In general, the Trump administration, the past 4 years of the Trump administration has been chaotic, filled with scandals. The presidency, the Trump administration has been largely an ineffective presidential administration, right? With basically no legislative achievements, with a sort of revolving door, at least early on the term of cabinet level members. This was not a well-run presidential administration. And then lastly, we have a change in the Democratic Party's nominee. Joe Biden was more favorably evaluated than Hillary Clinton was, and seemed to be broadly favorable to the public. So that's sort of the context for this 2020 election. So based on all this, what should we expect to see? Well, what we saw was basically the exact same thing we saw in 2016. Right? And in fact, it's maybe a little bit surprising how similar the 2020 election was to 2016. Maybe if you took 2016 and gave just a dash of the 2018 congressional elections, that's what we just witnessed. What do I mean by that? The 2020 presidential election that showed a Biden with a narrow electoral college victory, and certainly a popular vote victory of about what might end up being around 5 million votes, maybe 3 to 4 percentage points at the end of the day. This is largely a repeat of 2016. I don't see much of any evidence of a broad scale revolt against Trumpism among Republicans. I don't think there's really much evidence that that voters are punishing the congressional GOP down the line for supporting Trump, or for pushing through Amy Coney Barrett, or not passing legislation. If anything, the Republicans are going to pick up seats in the House, and likely will retain hold of the Senate, although that's a little bit in doubt. I don't see a lot of evidence that this election was really a referendum on Trump, or at least not a negative referendum on Trump, right? Or sort of a groundswell of anger about COVID, or about a response to a poor economy. In fact, I think if you look at the election results, what is really shocking is just how similar this was to 2016. And what I think that means is that we have lots of evidence of the strength of hyper-partisanship in the American public, and the ability of the candidates to maintain their core coalitions and mobilize them for the 2020 presidential election. So that's the overview. Let's talk a little bit about vote choice. And if you disagree with me, we can sort of circle back to this here at the end during the Q&A. So what drives vote choice in presidential elections? It may seem like a cop-out for me to say it's party, but it's party. No, really, it's party, and it's party more than anything else. And we like to think, yeah, it's party, but it's also blank, 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 blank. It's not, right? It's party identification. Everything else are slight marginal changes on top of partisanship. What do I mean by this? Well, something like 90% of voters, of partisans, of Democrats or Republicans, are going to support their major party candidate. That's just every election, right? It's not new now, but it's, maybe you might drop down to maybe 88%, or increase it to 92 or 93%. But election in and election out, you're going to get something like 90% of your partisans to stay at home and vote for your party's presidential candidate. And so we typically think about, well, if we can't do much to change the partisans, maybe we can change the independents, right? Those people who don't have a party attachment. Depending on the state, this could be anywhere from maybe 30% to even 40% or higher, who say they're independents, but they're lying, right? They're not being honest. They're not really independent. They have durable party attachments too. They just don't like using the label, right? And so they typically stay and vote consistently with one party. We call them party leaners, right? They lean towards one party rather than another, and they act an awful lot like partisans, particularly at election time. So what that's left is this small sliver of maybe 10% of the American public that are truly unaffiliated with one of the two major parties. That's not a lot of votes. Party identification, I'm going to argue here, is causally prior to other impacts on elections. And it is causally prior because of where our party identifications come from. For most people, your party ID gets formed as you enter into adulthood. There's a huge body of literature about political socialization that talks about this and the sorts of demographic characteristics that might shape your partisanship. When I teach public opinion and voting behavior, I always ask my students whether they share the same party as their parents. And by and large, they do, right? There's always some differences. Maybe your parents aren't political. Maybe you have a parent who's Republican and a parent who's Democrat, and so you don't have that focus. But most of the time, students have the party of their president. Of their parents. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because parents are, the household that you grow up in sort of defines your socioeconomic status. It shapes your values, right? What you think is important. And there shouldn't be any reason why the political values wouldn't also be conveyed through the parent-child relationship. So you grow up in a household and your party much of the time gets formed by your parents. It's also formed by the environment around you, your race and ethnicity, your gender, your socioeconomic status, right? Your income levels, your education levels, whether you're growing up in a rural town or a big city. These factors shape our interests and they shape our values, and one party can seem to speak to those interests and values better than another, and so partisanship forms relatively early in folks' lives. It is possible to change your party, but it doesn't happen that often. It doesn't happen as much as we might think it will happen based on folks following politics. So let me underscore this. Your partisanship is causally prior to the responses to political events, to the formation of ideology, like conservative or liberal issues, your opinions on the public policy issues of the day, which candidates the parties are running, how the candidates are campaigning. All of that stuff happens after your party identity is formed. There's a classic work in political science called The American Voter, called this the funnel of causality. That sounds like a very serious thing right there, funnel of causality. But what it's saying is that, the things that might impact elections, like which candidates are running and which events are salient, right? They might matter, but they matter that they're further down the causal line from party, right? Partisanship is causally prior, and it's going to impact how we view all those other steps in the election. So partisanship is costly prior. That dictates mostly how we view the elections. Things like which elites you're going to listen to about the election, about what matters in the election, about what the parties stand for, right? That's determined by your party to a large degree. Motivated reasoning is the idea that we don't reason rationally when we take in new information, but we do it in a motivated way that conforms to our pre-existing belief systems. So for example, if I'm a Republican and I've been watching the last 4 years, maybe I take in information about the Trump administration as, oh yeah, well, Trump is just unconventional. He's just not a politician, right? That's my psychological attempt to react to what would be considered negative information about my chosen candidate. It's motivated reasoning. Because the parties are rooted in social groups, there could be real differences in the interests to those groups, and therefore they might see public policy in real ways, really different ways that shapes their behavior. And then lastly, as a way that the partisanship really matters, is that it shapes how we view the other party as well as how we view our own. There's lots of evidence that this might be the dominant perspective right now in shaping American politics. Not necessarily that we're in love with our own parties, but that we really, really, really hate the other party, right? And this has been increasing over time. And I think really ends up shaping how we view the election, like in the election in 2020. Negative partisanship, like the dislike of the other party has been increasing over time. Okay, so if your partisanship is relatively stable and largely sets sort of the framework for an election, right? Because the parties have sort of cultivated these groups, group attachments that are rooted in social differences across the country. And if those don't change that much, then how can we get election outcomes which change? Well, some things could happen, right? You could have events that swing some of those unaffiliated voters from one party to another. That happens sometimes, right? Something like a war, right? Or an economic recession, right? Can do that sometimes. Maybe you can persuade a few percentages of folks to leave the other group and move to your group. Both of those, by the way, don't happen that often, right? Those changes are relatively small in terms of numbers of voters. What has been happening much more is this third point, that you could get differences in turnout based on motivating or mobilizing lower propensity voters, folks who don't always come to the polls. In the United States, it's a very normal election for presidents to maybe get 55 to 60% of eligible voters to turn out. So there's a huge proportion of the population of folks who don't vote in any given election who could vote, right? These are lower propensity voters. They could be mobilized, and some of them are favorable to your party's message. So the work of the parties then is to make sure they get every voter who could possibly get there to the polls out and to the polls, and then staying in line, maintaining their coalition to support their candidate. So differences in that turnout, right, could swing an election. And then, of course, we always have this sort of glacier change, slow change in group attachments. We don't always realize that that's changing, but it is, but it's just moving really slowly. And so it is possible that we'll see evidence in any given election of some sort of a movement in these group attachments with the parties over time. So under this framework of the importance of party identification, the importance of negative partisanship, the relatively lack of importance of persuasion and sort of response to events. How do we make sense of 2016, Trump's election in 2016? Well, I would say under that perspective, Trump maintained the GOP coalition, right? He didn't lose his core supporters, probably because of negative partisanship. He also helped to facilitate the movement of white, low-educated voters who were largely in urban and rural and ex-urban areas, some suburban, into the Republican Party. Not a lot, but enough, and enough in the right places that based on the Electoral College, he could win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania by small amounts, even though he lost the popular vote in 2016. And that's really the story of 2016. Okay, Dr. Bowen, that took a long time for me to talk about not the 2020 election. What about the 2020 election? I went through all of that because I think that is really sort of the foundation for how we should be thinking about last Tuesday's election. In fact, I think the data look very familiar to 2016. And when we think about sort of the narratives of what happened, we need to remember that by and large, we have a very similar story with just a little change. That little change means we'll have a different president, which is a huge change. But in terms of shifting in the vote, it's not that large. So the coalitions are very, very familiar to us, of people who have been following American politics. Here's a map of Biden's vote share across the country. Each dot is proportional to the number of votes cast for Biden in that area. Note that some of these rural areas, there's sort of a minimum size in these dots. So some of those votes, looks like more votes are coming from those rural areas than they actually are. But anyway, just how the map worked out. Familiar stuff though, the Democrats are getting votes in urban areas, and in the West and the Northeast. Chicago is a big one, but all along the Northeast corridor here, lots of voters live. Lots of areas that are more Republican, right? If you know this electoral map, still support Joe Biden to some degree, or he's still getting votes in some of these places. This map is showing here the size of the Republican of the votes coming from counties. It's all county level data. What about Republican voters? Trump's votes are coming again, similar places, but take a look up here in the Northeast, right? You don't see that big mass that you did in support for Trump that you saw with Biden. You see lower percentages in California, and actually almost every urban area across the country, right? I can go back, see those big dots, places like Chicago and the Northeast, and Atlanta and Southern California. And Republicans are getting, Trump is getting votes from there too, but not to the same extent. His support is hard to visualize here because each one of these little red dots in these rural counties is a little bit bigger than those blue dots, right? You kind of see it if I change from picture to picture. This is probably very familiar. This is sort of the divide in the country that we've been living with for some time now. And that story is still true today, like it was 4 years ago, like it was 10 years ago. Familiar coalitions of supporters for each of the two parties. If we want to compare them, this is a little bit harder to see, but let me zoom in on this. This would be a map that shows those proportional dots together in the same map. And so the areas in which you see a blue ring around the purple ring, those are areas in which Democratic vote turnout is higher than Republican turnout. So you see here Dallas down here, you see Chicago very clearly, you see some of the major cities in the Northeast clearly having these blue rings around them. Those are areas in which Biden is sort of running up the vote totals in comparison to Trump. Harder to see, but there are the Republican areas, right? You can sort of see these smaller counties that have red rings around them. Those are the areas in which Trump is turning out more voters than Biden is. Aren't a ton of ones that jump off the map, but almost every single one of these little counties here has a ring of red around them, showing that Trump is winning in those areas. But just that they're smaller, right? There are fewer votes in those areas. So familiar coalitions that have been established in the past. The story of 2020 is a lot of stability of those coalitions. What did change in 2020 was turnout. In fact, we saw a very high turnout, 66.4% of eligible voters turned out this election cycle. That's the highest since 1900, right? So in 120 years, this is the highest turnout rate. So we have high turnout and turnout changes that are going to benefit Biden for the presidential election. Not a lot of evidence of vote shifts. There is some, and I'll talk to you about it in a second here, but the big story here is one of turnout, not one of vote shifts. What these graphs show is the relationship between Clinton percent of the two-party vote in 2016 compared to Biden's vote share, two-party vote in 2020. The black lines, these 45-degree angle black lines, would show a one-to-one relationship, right? So every county dot that's sitting on this black line says, hey, Biden did just as well as Clinton did in terms of vote share, in this election. Any counties that have dots above that 45-degree angle line mean that Biden is getting a greater percent of the vote than Clinton did for those counties. And then any counties you see below that line show that Clinton did better than Biden in that particular county. I have here moving averages in blue that are calculated by state and are sitting here, sometimes overlapping with that 45-degree angle line, sometimes not. And they basically show that the trend between Clinton support and Biden support. And the general story here is just how similar these vote shares here between 2016 and 2020. These are the competitive states, by the way. These are the 10 closest states, the swing states. That said, a couple points to highlight from this graph. While in general, vote shares are almost exactly the same between 2020 and 2016, there are a few differences. Take a look here at Georgia, where even though the moving average blue line is almost exactly on that 45-degree line, you can just tell that the bigger counties are a little bit to the pro-Biden side, and the smaller counties are a little bit to the pro-Clinton side, right? So in a state like Georgia, Biden is doing better, just slightly better, in places that have more votes compared to what Clinton did. Pennsylvania is a similar story, except that you see this blue line, the moving average here is just to the Biden side of that split, right? So Biden is sort of shifting these counties just a hair, just by a percentage point or two, toward him and doing better than Clinton did in those areas. Michigan's story, sorry, I hope you don't make me dizzy here by moving this around. Michigan's story is very similar. And they're doing it in areas that are more competitive. They're not doing it by, hyper turnout of, or hyper, changes in votes in the most Democratic areas. One note I will point out here is what's happening in Florida and Texas, where in areas that Clinton did really well, Biden did not do so well in both of those states. So I have a little bit more to talk about those, and we'll come back to that later. So lots of evidence that the vote shares by county look very similar, with just a few key, very, very slight changes to Biden in areas that really mattered. Notice, Ohio would be an example of a state in which you see the opposite. Biden underperforms Clinton on average at all these different counties, right, in Ohio, in terms of vote share. What about turnout? Same graphs. This time we're plotting not vote share, but actual votes, numbers of votes in each of these counties. And you can see that across all of these states, Biden is turning out more voters than Clinton did. Trump's plot will look very similar to this too, with one key difference. The difference is that Biden is turning out more voters in places that have more votes than Trump did, right? Which is an advantage to Biden. So massive turnout, increasing turnout everywhere in almost every place in all of the swing states, even though it's not necessarily showing up in vote shares for many of these counties. Biden is still getting votes. And if the big counties are in areas in which Biden has more votes, then even the constant vote share is going to be a net increase for support for Biden once we aggregate up all these votes to the state level. So the emerging story here about turnout, both Republicans and Democrats, highly motivated, high turnout. Dems are slightly out mobilizing Republicans, leading to a very slight increase in vote share for Biden in a couple states, and an increase for Biden because of the fact that you're getting more votes from, even a constant vote share in a place that has more votes will net more votes to the Democratic side. And that's a lot of what happened in 2020 compared to 2016. Here's another way of looking at it. I'm not exactly sure how helpful this is, but I'm gonna try to see if I can explain this well. In each of these plots, we have here the change in turnout as a percent change, and that's the x-axis. And on the y-axis, you have the change in vote share. So what's the first thing to note here from both plots, the left here is Trump, the right here is Democratic turnout, Biden compared to Clinton. These mass of dots for county, this is called county level data, is to the right of 0 in both cases, meaning both Republicans and Democrats are increasing turnout in 2020 compared to 2016. Partly that's because we have more people in the country. Partly that's because we have basically no third party option in this election compared to 2016, right? So more people are voting for the two major parties. But a lot of it is because more people are voting, right? More people are turning out because of the stakes of this election in both cases. And they're turning out for both Trump and for Biden. But notice here what's happening for Trump. These are all, each dot represents a county. Trump is increasing his turnout percentage, right? He's increased the number of people who are voting for him in many, many counties. But in most of these counties, he's still slightly decreasing vote share in the county. Not in all counties, he's increasing in some, right? But more than not, he's slightly decreasing vote share, right? So his turnout is not being translated into increased vote share in the county. Biden's does. There are counties in which that his turnout, extra mobilization isn't matching Trump's, but there are plenty up here in this top right quadrant where Biden is getting more votes than Clinton in the county and a greater vote share than Clinton did. Again, not by a lot, maybe by only 1 or 2% in some of these places, but clearly an advantage here where Biden's turnout increases are leading to some increased vote share. Why that is, I think, is a really interesting question. My gut reaction is that Trump just has a little bit of a ceiling in these counties, right? He can mobilize supporters, but there aren't as many potential Republican voters in these areas. He's already mobilizing them at a really high rate in 2016. He can mobilize them even more, but you can only hit that rock, get water out of that rock, for so much, and there's nothing else that's going to come from it. Whereas Biden, his mobilization in vote-rich places, an increase in turnout can lead to a larger increase in vote share because there are more people who live in those places. And so that's, and sort of the possibility for a broader coalition that the Democrats have, I think, is part of that too. Okay, this one might be my most controversial take on the election. Biden's strength compared to Clinton, this might be a little bit of a surprise, is coming from counties with larger percent white populations. Biden's actually running behind in more diverse counties compared to Clinton. And take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, because there are some places like in California where the vote is still out in large part. So we'll have to see what happens when all of the votes are tabulated. But I want to suggest that what Biden did to win this election is he was able to do just a little bit better in rural white counties and in suburban counties with a high percent white of white voters. And these are voters that had kind of abandoned the Democratic Party in 2016, and he got just a few of them out to the polls in 2020. And these plots try to show that. The most important one here is this plot on the left. This is the x-axis here is the proportion white in the county, right? So again, 80% white and percent white. These are we're not talking about urban areas here, and we're not really talking about the South either. We're talking about the Midwest and the West, and some areas in the Northeast, which you have rural and suburban counties that are predominantly white. On the y-axis, you have the change in Trump vote share, 2020 minus 2016, right? So the portions of this plot above this dashed line would show that a county Trump did better in 2020 in terms of vote share than he did in 2016. Any of these lines that are below this dashed line show that Trump is doing worse in those counties in 2020 compared to 2016, right? So when these lines, these moving average lines cross this 0 point on the low end, Biden is doing better compared to Clinton, Trump is doing worse. And the high end, Trump is doing better in 2020 compared to 2016, Clinton did better than Biden, all right? And what you see, I have three different lines, one for rural counties, those are the blue, one for smaller metros, those are the green, and one for the largest 10 metro areas, those are the gray. And what you see here is about a 2 percentage point shift away from Trump and toward Biden in rural counties that are predominantly white. And a bigger, maybe about a 3.5 to 4 percentage point change in the metro areas, again, of the white counties. Again, Biden is appealing just a little bit to some of these places in which Democrats hadn't been doing as well in the past in 2016. The kind of opposite story in proportion Black and proportion Latino. One interesting note here is just to think about what might be happening here in the counties that have a high proportion Latinx of their county. There was some speculation in the election that this mattered a lot in Florida, right? With maybe some counties with high Cuban populations being persuaded by Republican attempts to brand Biden as a socialist or tie him to the left of the party. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly people were, the media was talking about maybe a slow outreach of the Biden campaign to Latinx communities. And you see that in the county data, right? In areas that have high Latinx populations, Biden still won these areas, but he did worse than Clinton did in these counties. Right? That's what these lines going up here tell you. There aren't a lot of counties that have proportion of Latinx that are greater than 0.6 or 0.7, but in the few areas that did are the areas that we see that that Biden is underperforming Clinton. If we run some regression analyses, you see the same general story here. And again, I think it's useful for us to sort of keep track of what we're doing. We have on one level we have overall support, right? Which counties are supporting Trump and which counties are supporting Biden, and then you have the change, right? How did Trump do in 2020 compared to how he did in 2016? So I've tried to present here some results from regression models to summarize both where Trump did well in 2016 and 2020, and then what might account for some of the changes that we're seeing between 2016 and 2020. Again, knowing that there aren't a lot of changes, right? They're smaller changes, but there are some. So what I've done here is I presented some demographic variables here on the left. And I've calculated what a min to max change would mean for that variable, say for median income here, moving from the poorest county to the wealthiest county. Well, in 2016, doing that would lead to a predicted increase in Trump vote share of 20.4 points. Okay, from going from the poorest county to the wealthiest county, holding everything else constant. So this is on average. These effects are on average. If you moved from the percent white without a bachelor's degree, the county with the lowest percent white without a bachelor's degree, to the county with the highest, you would increase Trump's support percent of the two-party vote by 50.2 points, holding everything else constant. And you see sort of the demographic relationships that you'd expect, except again, the relationship between Latinx and support for the parties. Just one quick caveat here. This is all sort of ecological inference stuff. This is not individual level data. It could be that counties with high proportion Latinx have other people in the counties who are acting differently, right? So maybe white voters in Texas, for example, are more Republican in areas where they're higher proportion Latino. So just as a note here, just because you see a group in the population doesn't mean that it's exactly that group who's doing the movement. We need to do more research to try to figure out who's actually doing the movement. But in general, I think this largely makes sense of what we think about the groups of the parties, right? Counties with higher percentage of whites with a bachelor's degree, Trump does worse in 2016. Well, he does worse also in 2020, right? 11 points, 2016, 15.6 points in 2020. Population size, right? If the bigger the county, the worse Trump does in both elections. So these first two columns, you see a lot of same stuff, right? The determinants shift a little bit. The relative importance shifts, from one election to the other, but by and large, it's the same factors. If we analyze the change from 16 to 20 as the dependent variable and try to predict that, The only factors that are statistically significant are the ones in which you see the numbers for here in the last column. Again, what I just showed you from before, counties with high proportions of African Americans and Latinx voters, Trump does a little bit better in 2020 compared to 2016 in those places. But he did worse in areas that have a large percentage of whites with a bachelor's degree. And again, I think it's sort of, it's hard to know exactly who's moving here because this is county level data, but it would certainly fit with the explanation of a movement from some whites in suburbs, predominantly suburban counties, away from President Trump. I wouldn't want to spend too much time on this. It is worth noting that the polls were a mess. And I feel like I never quite learned my lesson on this because I always, every new election, I'm like, well, the polls say, polls say Biden's going to win. Yeah, they did. And they were not particularly good. So the national estimates had Biden winning by about 8 percentage points in the popular vote. As of right now, it looks like he might win by about 3% of the popular vote. It might inch up a little bit as the rest of the votes are counted, maybe even 3.5 to 4%. But certainly it's not 8. So a pro Biden here bias or error in the polls, certainly. The state polls are even worse. Some of them were very off. If you think of like Wisconsin and Michigan, where the polls were suggesting 8 to 10 to 11 point victory for Biden, and it ends up being 1% or less. So some serious problems about what's going on with polling, particularly with state polls. I don't know exactly what could be driving it, and no one really knows yet. We need to do a lot more research. Some potential problems to sort of be aware of with polling here. It could be that we're getting differential non-response of party groups. Not necessarily even of party groups, but of the type of people who are responding to these polls, right? So it might be that you get one type of Republican who's willing to respond to a poll, but not every Republican looks like the one who's responding to the poll, right? Maybe the one who's responding to the poll is more likely to vote for Biden, or more likely to just slightly to have a lower opinion of President Trump or something, right? So we already have very low response rates. So any sort of additional differential non-response could be throwing off our models, particularly if it's something that we can't measure with census data. And if that's the case, then we can't just wait it away. What we've been doing with polling is, to sort of get around really low response rates from our telephone polls, or to use online convenience samples, which aren't random, they haven't been randomized. We have to use a bunch of weighting to reflect the populations that we want it to be representative of, right? But if the people who are answering the polls differ in some other way that we're not aware of, then we can't weight away the problem. And so this could be a really big issue going forward, but we'll have to do more work. I just want to be really clear. There is no conspiracy here. If any of you listened to the president's speech on election night, or whenever that night was, when it wasn't election night. It was when the media called the election for Joe Biden. There's no conspiracy. This is worst case scenario for pollsters. They hate this. This is a total disaster for them, and it puts in jeopardy their livelihood, and also sort of the faith in the enterprise of polling for the public. So this is not something they want at all. And so just sort of to note that. The other two things I'll just point out here is that there's always possible that there was a real change in public opinion. We don't have any evidence of that to date. There was evidence of that in 2016. So 2016, real public opinion change did seem to matter a little bit for the accuracy of the polls, but not as much here in 2020, at least that we know of. And lastly, forecasting turnout is always a hard thing to do because we don't know who's going to turn out, right? We have likely voter screens to try to capture who is likely to turn out, but we don't know who's going to turn out. And maybe voters themselves don't know if they're going to vote in every situation. So this is always a little bit of a guessing game. And we did just have a high turnout election, right? A uniquely high turnout election. So it's possible that something went wrong with the forecasting of turnout or the likely voter screens that showed, that didn't pick up some maybe lower propensity voters to vote who voted for Trump that we didn't think were going to turn out at the polls. So there's some possibilities there to think about. What's kind of puzzling about this is that the pollsters already changed their methodology to incorporate the ways they were wrong in 2016. And they were just as wrong, if not more so, in 2020. So it's going to lead to quite a bit of soul searching. No mandates. I don't see any evidence to think that there's the will of the public is clear that will shape what the federal government does, what a Biden administration is going to do. I just don't see any evidence of that here. I think the evidence by and large is we had a super close election in 2016. We redid it, and just enough people in just the right places switched to support Biden or were mobilized to support Biden, and that changed the election. Not a mandate for a shift in politics. So let's just wrap it up here really quickly. I would say, Dems, we think back about the election, I think Biden wins because of Trump. He was motivated. He was nominated because he could appeal to the exact places in which the Democrats lost the election in 2016. And guess what? I mean, he did it. He shifted. Now, maybe you could argue that a different person or a different strategy would have shifted more votes, but Biden did exactly what he was nominated to do. He switched just enough voters in just the right places to swing just the right states. And from a Democrat's perspective, I think that was successful. The coalitions remain pretty stable, probably solidifying the white lower educated voters movement into the GOP, and a little bit of a continuation of 2018's movement of white higher ed folks into the Democratic Party. And then, of course, the big story here is really shocking levels of high turnout and enthusiasm, which I think is just negative partisanship. People, are so frustrated and hate the other side so much they have to vote. They have to vote. And this is my last slide, I promise, and then we can turn to some Q&A. I think we have some difficult days ahead, to be perfectly honest to everyone here. I think it's very dangerous that the president has refused to concede the election. I think it's dangerous that he continues to claim, without listing evidence of widespread voter fraud. I think it's really dangerous that the GOP, at least some folks in the GOP, have enabled this, and instead of standing up for the legitimacy of the election, which elected them, have at least played around or continued to dabble in these claims of illegitimacy. And that should make us angry, I think, and it should make us concerned. And I think it's really troubling to see the GOP who's choosing again to, instead of speaking truth, even after the election, instead of speaking truth to the American people about what happened, they're allowing, they're being driven by sort of the extremist activist side of the party, and that's really disappointing. I think, going forward here, looks like most likely scenarios that we'll have continued divided government, with Republicans holding the Senate. Maybe it's possible that Democrats can win the two runoff elections in Georgia, and then have the narrowest possible margin in the Senate. But Congress is going to be split. The likelihood of serious change in legislation is non-existent for the next 2 years. And then, of course, the big broader story for American politics is a continued pro-GOP bias that's built into the American electoral system, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate and in the Electoral College. And that means that we have, a candidate who can win maybe even upwards of 5 million extra votes, but still win the presidency with the narrowest of margins. We could have a party win more votes for Senate, but still be at a disadvantage every year, and same in the House. All of that bad stuff, however, one other thing. For those of you who are upset about the way President Trump changed policy, remember, most of his achievements or shifts in policy were really acts of the president, because he couldn't get anything through Congress either. It was actually really a disappointing show in terms of legislation for Republicans. So they didn't pass any laws either. Everything that we witnessed for the last 4 years was really things like executive orders, changes in foreign policy, and Biden, you can expect to undo those. We probably should see pretty large differences in immigration policy, for example, in the country. Regulations about the environment, about foreign policy, how we relate to our neighbors, and maintenance of international organizations. And then, of course, the big one might be the response to the coronavirus that would look different under the Biden administration. Courts are a little bit of a question mark, because it's yet to be seen how much McConnell and the Republican Senate would allow Biden to nominate judges, and I'm concerned about that. All right, folks, sorry I spoke a little longer than I intended to. I'd love to throw it open for questions and comments from you.
Dr. Bowen, perhaps we could begin with a couple of questions that just came up in the last couple of minutes of your talk. First, we have one from Brian Potter. Question is, do we know if the Libertarian candidate drew more voters from Trump or Biden?
I don't know. That's a great question, Brian. I think what's a little bit surprising is how similar, again, these results look in 2020 compared to 2016, where you had in Gary Johnson, a Libertarian candidate that actually got 3 to 4% of the vote, which was much larger, and a Green Party candidate, which was taking in some votes in some places. And but it looked like it was a wash by and large this election. As far as Jorgensen, I don't know. I don't know if these voters would have voted for one of the candidates or the other, or would have just not voted if they had to choose. But that's a good question. We'll need to get back into the survey data to know what would have happened in those areas.
Another question from Cadence Wilsey in the Q&A. Thanks for helping us all process the 2020 election. A few political scientists and analysts predicted this election might bring a party realignment. It seems like you disagree. I wonder, does point number 4, Biden is doing better in larger percentage white counties and suburbs, Trump gained some minority voters, hint at a possible voter realignment?
Yeah, I mean, that's thank you, Cadence, for that question. I absolutely think that if you were looking for evidence of perhaps a realignment, that was where it would be. There was some talk from the exit polls that maybe African-American men, for example, were maybe slightly more pro-Trump than would have been expected. Some evidence, again, we talked about this in sort of the areas with high Latino populations that were a little bit more pro-Trump than would have been expected. And some of these areas, suburban, some rural areas that did a little bit better than Biden. But I think these are just marginal changes. and I would hesitate trying to say too much of that. In fact, many of these, we didn't really talk about this in the talk, but many of these areas that Biden did slightly better in the suburban, wider areas, they still voted for Republicans in Senate and the House, right? So they split their ticket and voted against. We think split their ticket and voted against President Trump. So I really don't think so. I think it'd be hard pressed to find evidence that this is sort of a large sea change in American politics. In fact, I think it's given the increase in turnout of all these groups, it's more likely to solidify the changes that were happening in 2016, with maybe a little bit of a switch of suburbs, higher educated voters towards Dems. That was going on in 2016 too, and it really accelerated in 2018.
A question from Aaron Ackerman. Do you have predictions for the races for the Georgia Senate seats?
Aaron, that's a great question because so much is going to hinge on it. No, my gut is that the Republicans are going to pull it out. That I could be wrong. We're sort of in a new world, right? Where as we see these very slight changes in the parties, it's harder to predict who's going to be advantaged by lower turnout elections, right? So does the Georgia runoff mean that the president's supporters aren't going to show up? Those extra voters that he was going to be able to mobilize, will they show up? But then what's going to happen to the Democratic coalition when Trump isn't on the ballot, right? Are their voters going to show up? So I don't know. I was reading some stuff that suggested that maybe what McConnell is doing by continuing to talk about an illegitimate presidential election might be because he's trying to motivate Republican voters for that Georgia runoff. So he might have some evidence that he's concerned about that runoff election and is trying to fuel turnout in Georgia. Who knows? I'm glad I don't live in Georgia though. They're going to have so much money and so many advertisements, and oh man, it's going to be crazy for the next months because in lots of ways, any sort of agenda that the Democrats are hoping to have, really depend on winning that election. So I'm not brave enough to make a prediction.
Question from Victoria Mamari. We know that as you get old, you tend to move toward being more conservative. With my generation, it seems as if more and more young people are more liberal than ever. Increased social movements, negative partisanship, etc. Do you think that the country in general will get more liberal as time goes on?
Maria, that's a great question. So there are two things to think about here. There's life cycle effects. So what happens to you as you age, right? And you're right, people have in the past tend to move to more conservative ideological perspective as they get older in their life cycle. There's also cohort effects, right? So you have generational differences, right? And every generation's path isn't always the same. We probably overanalyze generations, but there's still some underlying truth to how they might impact politics. And the millennial generation is more liberal than previous generations, even once you hold age constant, right? So if you're, say, 30-year-old, a millennial is going to be more liberal than a 30-year-old Generation X or a 30-year-old boomer was at that stage of their lives too. Yes, I think we're seeing evidence that the country is becoming more diverse, and that younger voters who are replacing more conservative older voters in the electorate are also more liberal, and that is those are real structural advantages to the Democratic Party. But we've been talking about this for decades now, right? In fact, after 2000 and late 2000s, there was a book that was talking about the permanent Democratic majority, right? We've sort of been waiting for this to happen based on these trends of being a more racially diverse country and a country that has the younger populations that are more liberal. And we haven't really seen that in electoral politics yet. Although I would say, the one note here is that we need to keep in mind that Democrats are winning presidential elections. They're getting more votes, but it's electoral college that means that they're not always winning the election. They're getting more votes for the Senate. And it's the fact that the Senate has a small state bias that is advantaging the GOP and leading to control of the Senate, right, by Republicans. So there's sort of the other layer of our institutions interacting with these population changes as well.
Question from Yarden Muck. Is there any chance that faithless electors overturn the results of the election?
I don't think so. Of all the things we should be worrying about right now, folks, I don't think faithless electors is going to be it. There are some Supreme Court cases that basically reaffirmed the state's right to direct by law that electors vote for the person they're supposed to vote for. So I don't think we need to worry about that too much. If it is a problem, time to man the barricades. So we'll get there. But I of all things we could worry about, I don't think that's the one we have to worry about.
Question from Shrish Jawadwar. How do you think the results of this election will affect the 2022 midterm elections, since they're usually a referendum of the president's job so far?
Thanks, Shrish. This is a really good question. And, I'm going to be, I feel like it might be a little bit negative today. What I would expect is what we see almost every midterm election, which is that voters move away from the president's party. So if Biden won, and once this whole saga of the election is over, he's going to be seen as the Democrats controlling the presidency and the administration, and I would expect to see a swing away from Biden. Now, two points here, sort of as walking that back just a little bit. One, part of that response is sometimes because of real change in public policy, right? Voters see that public policy is shifting to the left or to the right, and they don't like it, and so they really respond by trying to in a thermostatic way to try to stop that change. I don't think we're going to see much policy change to the left in these next 2 years. So if that's true, and if we see the GOP in the Senate basically stopping all major policy, then maybe that shift won't be as large. The other thing is that the surge and decline view of midterm elections would say that the reason why we see the midterm slide is because the president's coalition isn't motivated and doesn't show up. But you could also see that perhaps in this election, Trump's coalition won't show up, right? And so it's less clear to me exactly what the decline will look like when, Biden's, was a Biden surge? Was this Trump surge? They are both surging. So what happens when the presidential ticket isn't there? I think it's a little bit of an interesting question. So I'm not going to make any firm predictions yet, but I would expect probably a smaller than normal midterm decline for Democrats in 2022.
A question from Lucas Vaco. Republicans gained seats in the U.S. House. Is there a reason why? Trump, demographics, et cetera?
Yeah, thanks, Lucas. I think the evidence here is that you had very strong turnout for other Republican parties, and remember, the Republicans have a built-in advantage in the House too. One is gerrymandering, right? They were able to control more of the districts that were drawn in 2010 than Democrats were, so they have sort of an advantage in the maps. But also, they have an advantage just by the use of geographic districts. the Republican support is more evenly distributed across space in the United States. And thinking back to the map that I showed you earlier, Democratic support is packed into highly Democratic areas that have less geographic space. And what that means is when you draw those maps, Democrats sort of have a native disadvantage in congressional districts. Even if you didn't talk about gerrymandering, that would be true. But when you add in gerrymandering, that makes it even worse. So there's sort of a built-in pro-GOP bias there with the House in terms of districting. But I also do think that the story, we'll have to get more evidence of this, but something to watch on is the story of perhaps some people, particularly in higher educated suburbs, where some GOP voters, or maybe people on the line, so unaffiliated voters, voted for Republicans in Congress and Democrats and Joe Biden on the top of the ticket. So that's another story to sort of watch out there.
A question from Catherine Wallentine. Do you think the number of registered independents will decrease over time as polarization increases?
Great question, Catherine. Catherine, it's so nice to hear from you. I'm glad you came to the talk. That's a good question. You know, I don't have at my fingertips right now what has changed in the numbers of independents. I would say there's not a lot of reason to formally join the party unless you're in a state that requires you to you know, let's say they have a primary system that requires you to be a Republican or Democrat to vote in that state. Some states do, some states don't. And I think that right now, you know, given how much polarization is happening, there's still, you know, people feel uncomfortable a little bit with the level of partisanship that's there, and that we like to think that we're not so polarized. We don't want to be, and so I could see people still saying they're independent, even though they're not, right? So it's sort of interesting to track both sort of the attachments to the parties, but also the willingness of people to say they're not attached, but then to act like they're attached. And I'd have to look at the data to see what's happening over time on those.
A question from Connor Carlin. On the Latinx vote, we know that as far back as the primary, the one demographic that Biden consistently underperformed with was Latinx people, which overwhelmingly supported Sanders. Do you think that the trend with the Latinx vote in this election was in part from depressed turnout in younger Latinx voters who weren't as enthusiastic about Biden?
Connor, that's a great question. I'm going to say that I don't know. I would love to hear from people who are doing some of that work of mobilizing different groups of the parties to really listen to them to see what they think is happening here. And also the voters themselves, right? Using survey data and talking to folks about their support. I do think it's real. It's real, at least in some places. We're not talking about super large changes in the group, you know, Latinx voters across the country still predominantly are voting for Democrats, but the shift was real, and maybe perhaps for those of us who weren't following the primaries, maybe a little bit surprising given some of President Trump's rhetoric and focus on immigration. So I think there's a lot to unpack. The other thing to remember, of course, is that this is a diverse group. We don't appreciate the diversity as much as we should of the Latinx community. We're talking about different groups, some who've been here on many generations, you know, for as long as the states have been a part of the union, some voters who are recent immigrants, some voters from Mexico, some from Cuba, some from Puerto Rico. There's just lots of variation here. And we put them in a regression model under one variable, but that doesn't mean that we can really capture what they're doing, the way they're behaving well using those models. So that's another thing to sort of keep in the back of your mind. Across the country, it may not matter so much, but in specific areas where the Latinx community might be predominantly Mexican and predominantly first and second generation immigrant. might be look very differently than a state that has a large Cuban population that's been here for 3 generations. So it's just that sort of diversity that we have to try to keep in mind.
Question from Bill Healy. Could the most recent election create a push for greater voting uniformity across the states? Could the federal government set a floor for things like VBM, early voting, polling locations per 100 voters, et cetera, which states could go beyond?
Yes, absolutely, Bill. I know we talked about this a little bit earlier. We could see that. Congress could absolutely pass a federal law that required some specific standards. Obviously letting states still do manage their own elections. I don't know. I mean, I'm sounding like a broken record here, but I think the idea that we should be expecting Congress, to be leading on this, given what we just witnessed in the election, my heart's been broken too many times by waiting for Congress to do what it's supposed to be doing, that I'm not going to have it broken again. I think it's much more likely, that we'll see states continuing to do what they want. And one thing that I will say that we might see out of this election is that we did have a bunch of states who had new experiences with convenience voting. They made voting much easier because of the pandemic than they had before. And by and large, that went well. Elections ran smoothly. People, I think, seemed to like it. I certainly enjoyed putting my mail-in ballot into the drop box. And I'm hopeful that might shape the voting law in at least some places that experience with some new mechanisms. But I think, particularly since I don't know that Congress, that the GOP is going to see these changes as beneficial to them. And if that's the case, then I don't think they're going to be willing to participate in a bill.
Question from Obioma Chukwuka. Do you believe Trump will still have a strong influence in the coming elections and politics, and will his following remain in the next few years?
Oh, what an excellent question. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I don't know if he's going to run again in 2024. I don't know that he wants to. My personal opinion is that the claims about voter fraud are really about Trump trying to save face for his position going forward in the next 4 years. He doesn't want to be seen as someone who lost the election. And I think I could totally see him continuing to hold his rallies around the country and just trying to create attention for himself. Because if we really get down to it, that is President Trump's chief skill, is getting people to look at him, right? Like above everything else, trying to capture attention and sort of making a scene is Trump's chief political ability. And I think he likes it. I think he likes the attention. And frankly, I think I see him having much more fun just going around the country, getting money from supporters, saying whatever he wants, holding rallies. And there's nothing that would stop him from doing that as long as people want it. Enough people want it. So I kind of think that's what I would expect him to do. The real question is how the GOP responds to his loss. Do they keep, does that connection between GOP voters and Trump, does that last after it's clear to everyone he lost? And does the GOP continue to embrace those voters and Trump as a way of trying to help themselves going forward? And if they do, then Trump stays powerful. They could always stop, right? They're gonna have to listen to him anymore at all. But will they? I don't know.
Okay, I think maybe we have time for one final question. Question from Alex Garlick. What did you see in the elections at the state level? Were the ballot questions better for conservatives or liberals?
Oh, Alex. Oh my goodness. Well, obviously in New Jersey, we had the passage of legalized marijuana, which was a big deal. I'm gonna defer to you about across all the states. I haven't been paying too much attention. How can you pay attention to the ballot initiatives when there's a presidency at stake? The one thing I will note is that there was a sort of this possibility that you would see a shift in legislative control of the states, or at least in the share of state legislative races that went to Democrats if Biden had this sort of large victory that some of the polls were predicting. And that obviously didn't happen, which means that the control of the states is going to look again awfully lot like what we had coming into this election, and stopped maybe the potential for Democratic gains in places that may have tipped redistricting away from the GOP. So again, probably the story is continuity more than change, but I honestly didn't follow ballot initiatives as much as I should have this election cycle.
Well, thank you so much. It is 1:51. Technically, this is the end of our allotted time. We still have a bunch more questions. Dr. Bowen?
I can stay as long as people want to hear me talk.
Okay. It looks like a few people have had to go, but we still have quite a few people here. So I'm going to go on for at least a few more minutes, at least maybe for another 10 minutes anyway, until 2 o'clock, if that's okay with people.
Yeah, it's fine with me.
All right, great. So I'll just continue going down our list of questions here that we've got in the chat and in the Q&A section here of Zoom. Michael Triotola asks, is identity relevant in explaining vote choice?
Michael, that's really interesting. I'm not exactly sure about what identity you're talking about. Basically, every social identity that we think of as important to ourselves ends up mattering at least somewhat in the vote. So, racial and ethnic identities, gender identity, absolutely. Although I think people expected there to be a little bit of a larger gender gap than what we ended up seeing in this election. Still big though. Still big with men more likely to support Republicans and women more likely to support Democrats. Folks who are transgender or non-binary. It's hard to get sort of a measure of them in public opinion data and election data because of the size of that group. But but anecdotally, I certainly think that's true. That matters for their identity and their political affiliation towards the Democratic Party, which is the party that's pushing for expansion of rights for that group.
A question from Teo Dumas. To what extent do you think the changes we've seen in the last 2 election cycles are about Trump rather than broader, long-lasting societal changes?
Yeah. This is another great question. It's certainly possible that 100 years from now we'll come back and we'll say, that was globalization, or that was the shifting in the economy in ways that impacted rural whites and allowed them, or sort of moved them toward the message that Trump wanted. But it sort of takes both of those things, right? You need the opportunity, the demand for that change, and then you need to have the person or the strategy that's able to capitalize on it. And there is a difference between Mitt Romney and Donald Trump, right? As far as standard bearers for their party. They're both rich white guys, but they made very different appeals to voters. And again, not talking about gigantic sea change stuff, but slight movements of those party coalitions can make a difference. And particularly, I think Trump is able to sort of keep intact that original coalition that Romney had, that McCain had, that Bush had, and then add some people who aren't natural pairings to that. and then that's, and that sort of was very meaningful to him. Would a different candidate have done that? Would a Marco Rubio or a John Kasich have done that in 2016, or Ted Cruz? I don't think so. They would have kept the main coalition, but would they have added anything to it is another question. Although, again, I do want to point out that Trump loses a little bit of people in that too, right? So little shifts, sort of pro and against. He sort of won and lost a little bit, and we saw, in fact, maybe you could see 2018 and 2020 as sort of a response to that Trump coalition of a little bit more evidence in 2018 and 2020 of those people that felt a little bit alienated from the way that he was changing the party and moving against him in these elections. And it maybe it cost him the presidency in the long run.
A question from Raquel Sosa Sanchez. I was wondering, with the growing number of popular vote victories for Democratic presidential candidates in recent history, what incentives do Republicans have to begin appealing to growing urban areas?
Raquel, this is a great question. And maybe this is even the question. When will Republicans start trying to win a majority of voters? Right now, the institutions are allowing them to hold on to power without winning a majority of voters, and their base doesn't want them to adopt the policies that they would need to adopt, or make the outreach that they would need to adopt to pull in those folks. And if you remember the early 2000s, and then also the Obama years, there was lots of conversation among Republicans about how they have to reach out to Latinx voters. They have to reach out to urban voters. They have to, because they could see the demographic trends were going away from them, and the party would be in trouble if they didn't start making those changes. What Trump did was he doubled down on the white voters. That's what he did in 2016. And again, this is largely the same sort of strategy that he's had since then as well. And and he was able to win because of Electoral College the first time, and almost able to win again. I don't know. I think the real danger for Republicans is going to be what if this change in the suburbs that we saw in 2018 and a little bit in 2020, if that continues, there's no path for Republicans to govern without the suburbs, right? They need the suburbs. They need to have the rural areas plus the suburbs, because they're getting blown out in the urban areas. So if you see continued movement of the suburbs, I think that's really dangerous. And maybe you see some congressional Republicans pushing for changes in the party. But it's really unhealthy. It's unhealthy for the whole country that Republicans aren't trying to sort of be that broad tent. And I actually think this is an important point for Democrats too. The Democrats nominated a candidate so that they could win back just a few of the right voters in the right places, and it was successful. And that's actually a strength of the party, that they're willing. I know many of you might be very progressive. It's a strength of the party that both moderate and progressive folks can have a home in the party at the same time. And that you have these fights among Democrats about, well, it should be more progressive or should be more moderate, and should we appeal? That means the party is trying to win a majority of Americans. And that's its strength. It's not its weakness. And the Republican Party would be much, much better off if it tried to do that too. But it's not right now.
Maybe one more. Then at least I, for one, will have to go. From Roman Brooks, since the Trump campaign is fighting in courts to throw out votes and contest the election results, if any decisions are made, will it affect the House and Senate races that are associated with those votes?
Yes. Yeah. I was talking to my POL 200 class today about this. The same ballots, right? So if you throw out a ballot, that impacts both the presidential race as well as the Senate and House races. So I think McConnell is being really disingenuous when he's talking about how, oh, the voters have spoken and elected more Republicans in the Senate and the House, and then, but we don't know about the president because those haven't been certified. That's baloney. That's ridiculous. Don't fall for it. It's if there are any changes by these court cases, they're going to impact everyone. They're not going to just impact the president. And it's all sort of a game anyway. It's not. I don't think it's a serious attempt to try to throw out the ballots really. I hope I'm right about that. I hope it's not a serious attempt to throw out the ballots. Certainly doesn't seem like there's going to be enough to change the election results, but we shall see.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's 2 o'clock. I, for one, need to go.
Yeah.
It sounds like Dr. Bowen does too. Thank you all so much for coming. This was a wonderful discussion. It was great to see so many people come and so many people to participate. Please do check the Politics Forum website for information about our final Politics Forum talk of the semester, which is a week from today. And I hope to see you there as well. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your semester. And thank you again, Dr. Bowen, for your talk today.
Thank you, everyone. Great questions. Thanks for coming.